Okay, should you go to business school? See, I went to business school back in 2012. Um, just finished high school. I was studying mathematics and sciences with the goal of basically going to engineering school. Everybody who studied what I studied in high school, their primary goal was to go to engineering schools. Um, at the time, I didn't feel like engineering school would suit me. Um, I felt that by being an engineer, I would always be destined to work for somebody. Um, and I didn't like the idea of working for somebody. Around the same time, I got interested in finance, um, in part because my sister went to business school. And so I started reading things about the economy, about finance, and that world seemed interesting. There was something big picturey about it. You know, when you talk about economics, you feel like you're talking about very, very big subjects. Whereas when you're talking about engineering, often you're like very specific, very narrow in what you're describing. And I enjoyed that about economics and finance and in general the world of business. And business, makes the world go round. So I was determined that when I'll finish high school, I'll go to a business school. And it was common amongst our um, my peers that time to basically apply for pretty much a wide range of things. Um, you could apply to medical school directly. You could apply to business school, engineering school. So typically, what people did was that they would apply to a range of places. Whereas I was very, very determined to just go to business school. So I've only applied to business schools at the end of my high school. Ultimately, I got accepted into one, um, and I went to one. I went to a place called Carnegie Mellon. The business school is called Tepper Business School. Spent 4 years. It's kind of known for being more of a quant business school. And if I'm being honest, I think to some extent, if I was to go back in time, knowing what I know now, I would have made different choices. I think I would have studied something a bit more technical, if that makes any sense. I would probably have studied computer science or software engineering, um, maybe uh, biomedical engineering. I would have done something a bit more technical, and there's a few reasons why. Um, but before I get into that, I'll go back in time to when I was in high school because what I'm going to tell you right now is something that my sister told me. And my sister, as I said, went to business school. But when I was in high school and I told my sister I want to go to business school, she told me don't do that. Go study engineering or do something a bit more technical for your undergrad. Not that business isn't a technical discipline, but you'll understand a bit more what I mean. And she told me you can always go do an MBA afterwards and learn in those 2 years what you'll pretty much learn in an undergrad of business school, and you'll probably even get a better degree or like a more prestigious degree if you do an MBA rather than doing an undergrad in business administration. Um, and quite rapidly, as I was studying my undergrad, I realized that I probably made a mistake studying business. And the biggest kind of red flag was when I realized that the two career paths that people who study business administration typically want to go into, investment banking and consulting, don't really require a business undergraduate degree. They, in fact, hire from a wide range of disciplines and majors: philosophy, history, biological sciences, medical studies or medical sciences, medical students, business administration. Your undergraduate degree didn't really matter to a large extent. Whereas when you're going for a software engineering job, a mechanical engineering job, an aerospace engineering job, any kind of specialized field like that, you will not be able to get a mechanical engineering job as a business undergrad. There's just no chance. Like the majority of disciplines will want you to have a background um, in the field that they're hiring you for. Now, whether what you're doing on the job requires that level of education or not is a totally different story. But the majority of jobs out there, with very few exceptions, they will want you to have some background and a major that aligns with what you're going to study. Now, you could find software engineers that have studied electrical engineering or mechanical engineering, for example, um, as long as they've had enough coding experience and maybe some software engineering internships. But investment banking and consulting, they really didn't care as much. There is a very, very big difference between, studying philosophy and finance. The gap is quite important in terms of knowledge of what you cover over 4 years. And that frustrated me because at that moment I did realize that, oh my God, I just decided to spend 4 years of my studies. And I think I figured this out in my first or second year of undergrad. But it was a bit too late for me to switch because it would have meant I would spend 5 years in university. Um, and I didn't have the finances to do so. But I realized, oh my God, this was probably a mistake. I should have probably studied something much more technical because ultimately, um, you could go on and explore these things like software engineering jobs or mechanical engineering jobs, whatever you want to do. And then if you're kind of bored, you can always pivot. There's nothing that really stops you from pivoting into something like marketing or product management or um, finance or consulting. You just go do an MBA and you can break into these fields. It is much, much more difficult to break into these technical fields like mechanical engineering, aerospace engineering, if you come from a background of finance. Even if you wanted to, for example, say, oh, I'm going to go and I want to do a pivot. You know what? I figured I really enjoy tinkering and I really enjoy like designing things and building actual things. How about I go back to school and become a mechanical engineer, for example? You can't do that just by going doing masters directly. No, you probably have to basically redo the whole path. Go spend 4 years in undergrad or 3 years and then do your masters, for example, before you're able to break into that field. So it's the pivot from a non-technical field to a technical field is a much much more difficult one than the reverse. Um, and so yeah, that those I think those two realization, um, kind of came to me in my second year. I was like, well, it's gonna be difficult to pivot. And at that time, I started getting interested in the world of startups and building things, and I was running hackathons. So I was like, wow, this field is amazing. You could build things. There's a certain satisfaction that you get from creating something or producing something that you just didn't have that sense of satisfaction in business administration. I'm going to talk a little bit deeper about what business education looks like. But I yeah, I was like, well, it will be hard for me to pivot. The other thing that I think I started picking up on is as I started doing internships, I rapidly realized these internships don't directly tie to what I study. They might in some very, small ways, but, and I think this applies to everything. Like, irrespective of what you study, there's always what you do in the job is going to be quite different than what you've studied. Like, and oftentimes you don't have that kind of width of scope and breadth of knowledge that you do in university. You won't have the same experience when you're at a job. But um, whereas I've seen these people, these computer scientists, building their little projects and kind of making things. I took a computer science class, an introduction to computer science. We built like a video game at the end. It was a very very satisfying experience, um, and that kind of sense of accomplishment and craftsmanship that I got from that class, no business class has actually provided me. Um, and I think when I look back, the most interesting classes that I took in as an undergrad were not business classes. They were not finance, accounting, economics. No, they were like history classes because I was always interested in the humanities. So a lot of the history classes and some of the technical classes, either in statistics, for example, introduction to regression, um, introduction to health sciences research, the computer science class that I took, um, a design fundamentals class. I mean, these classes that were totally unrelated in a way to what I was planning to study, frankly. So I think that was a kind of a second signal. And I think if you're in an undergrad and you're studying something and I've rejected that kind of feeling initially. When I was in my first year of undergrad, it was kind of a generic kind of year. You take a bunch of things. Um, you don't really study a lot of business focused classes. I think the major things that we did were accounting, introduction to business, economics, and frankly, I found all of these classes very boring. I found the introduction to business very boring. I found the accounting class very boring. I found the introduction to principles of economics class very boring. Whereas I was finding classes in history and English way more intellectually stimulating. And I think this is the big part. I did not find any of the business classes to be very intellectually stimulating. They were quite dull, if you're to ask me. There was nothing. No, there was no aha moments. A lot of the things seem to be, you didn't have to really study them to really kind of figure it out. Um, some things were made to look um, more formal than they actually are. For example, in Introduction to Principles of Economics, there's a lot of formalization of principles and supply and demand and how these supply and demand curves are built. But I felt like a lot of that is like it's quite simple. Like conceptually, it's very simple, but there's a lot of layers of complexity or of apparent complexity added to the discipline to make it seem it's like as intellectual and as intellectually demanding as maybe something like mathematics or physics. But it's not. Like it wasn't. Like I've never felt like it was. But the rest was very simple arithmetic. Like accounting is just simple arithmetic. Finance is just simple arithmetic. There's nothing like unless you're going into like financial markets type of finance and derivatives pricing and all. You're not really doing anything like out of the ordinary. Um, so I think that should have been a red flag. That the moment I've realized or I've started sensing that, oh my god, I'm not being intellectually stimulated by this stuff. Maybe I should have listened to that inner um, feeling and made a decision or a switch or wanted to change something at that time, but I didn't. Uh, I think the second red flag should have been the internships that didn't really kind of feel or seem interesting. Although, I think of talking to a lot of people. There's a lot of people in different fields that experience the same thing when they go in, whether they're mechanical engineers or aerospace engineers or biological sciences students. They all, to some extent feel like maybe they're not being given a lot of important and challenging tasks, and it's understandable from the perspective of the other party that they don't want to take a risk giving you something that you may not be able to deliver on. um, but I think that should have been the second red flag. That the internships themselves weren't as interesting. So the curriculum was not very stimulating or interesting. The internships themselves and the work itself wasn't intellectually stimulating or interesting. Um, Added to the fact that there is these like inherent challenges to, you got everybody in the most on demand or like in demand fields being basically willing to recruit from any background. Whereas, like, why am I studying business administration if in fact I don't need this major to go work as a banker or as a consultant? Like I could go and study something that will never be able to study. Like maybe I don't know, I could go and study biological sciences. And I know two people, I know a person at least in my circle of friends from undergrad who they studied biological sciences as an undergrad and then they went on and did a master's in biological sciences here at McGill in Montreal, and they're working as consultants in Bain. I mean, you know, and I would love to have spent 5 years of my or 6 years of my life basically learning about biology. It would have certainly way it would have been way more interesting than what I studied as an undergrad. Like because these things you can't just sit there. Like there is Like, here's the difference. I feel like every time I talk to somebody who did computer science or biological sciences, you couldn't just sit there in a class and listen to something and see it and say, like, most of the time, you when you would learn something, you're like, okay, this is incredible. Like how the DNA works. Like, you can't just sit there and think a little bit and be like, yeah, that seems like obvious. No, there's nothing obvious about how a DNA works. Whereas when you sit in an accounting class or a finance class, or for that matter, principles of economics or advanced economics class, a lot of what's being taught, you're like, well, this seems obvious. Like, is you don't like, why are we spending a semester studying this when it can all be compressed into like a crash course of 3 months. Um, and then when you study marketing, it just seems there is no consistent pattern. It just all seems so fluffy. There is no there are no like insights, the deeper insights of a bigger understanding of how the world works or operates. Um, I don't know. Like economics, all of economics can, in many way, can be boiled down into everything is a question of supply and demand. Like, oh yeah, well, I didn't know that. Like everything is a question of supply and demand, and to some extent, that humans, they're kind of rational when they make decisions at the aggregate level. Like when you aggregate a lot of humans, like thousands and thousands of humans or hundreds of thousands of humans, their decisions, their collective decisions, are to some extent rational, and that is why we have we can consistently, to some extent, have certain predictions about how demand is gonna, like, that they will do something, that they'll, like a human will always pick the cheaper version if presented with two goods that all this, with similar maybe like criteria, they'll pick the cheaper one, for example. Or like, there's a bunch of principles of like of how like a rational decision maker operates. There's certain assumptions, and those assumptions, like to some extent are there is some criticism of them, but like they're but yeah, the TLDR is economics boils down to, oh, supply and demand. Oh, duh, I didn't know that. Money is based on supply and demand. Interest rates are based on supply and demand. Well, although they're technically influenced by the central bank, labor markets are dictated by supply and demand. Everything is basically like, well, you didn't, like, you don't need a genius to do that. The second frustrating thing is, with all these advances in research that they've done, they're still unable to really make very strong predictions. Like, I don't know. It just like seems to me like it's just funny. Like, it's this field that pretends to be scientific. Like, I mean, finance and economics in particular, they're two fields that the deeper you go, the more you're like, wow, this seems to be a lot of math involved in them and all. And they have this kind of surface area of like this pretentiousness of like, we're scientific, like, oh, well, this is a scientific field. But they can barely make any accurate predictions. That is just the reality. Like, most of economic forecasts are like have a 50% chance of being right or a 50% chance of being wrong. Most of the pricing of most of the assets in the world, be it options, stocks, companies, they're just very imprecise. And I think ultimately the TLDR is these two disciplines are trying to study very, very uncertain phenomenons. And all these methodological advancements that they have, just ultimately they don't really provide them a significant edge. You can go and learn all of this stuff, all these methods in econometrics, in economics, and you can study so much stuff, spend so much time studying finance, and yet you go into the field and you're unable to do your job properly. Like a random, possibly a retail investor can beat you. A bunch of random people pull in their forecasts on what the economy would look like might outperform you. Um, a passive index fund can outperform you if you're an investor. I mean, like, if you can't bring on a bunch of random people and tell them to go do surgery against a surgeon, and they will somehow maybe potentially perform the same or a little bit worse, or maybe even better. No, like a surgeon will outperform them by a wide margin. And the same for a bunch of things. You can't bring a random person into a laboratory and tell them, oh, can you synthesize DNA or whatever, a protein ABC here. They can't just do it because of a little bit of common sense, and it just doesn't work that way. But that's the I think the curse of business, as a discipline that you go to study. The I think the fourth element was, and if you go back, I said earlier that I wanted to become a my own boss. I wanted to have my own thing. I didn't like the idea of having to report to somebody and be told by somebody what to do. Um, but the reality is, when you go to business school, that is what we've been that they groom you for. They're not grooming you to be an entrepreneur, and you realize quite rapidly in business school that there is nothing that you learn in business school that can actually provide you with any sort of edge in being an entrepreneur. Yeah, maybe you learn accounting, but most of the entrepreneurs, they just hire an accountant to do their accounting. Like, you can't learn how to be an entrepreneur in a classroom. That you just that's not possible. No matter how much business schools, no matter how prestigious the business school, no matter how much they say that they can teach you entrepreneurship, whatever, like you can't. Like it's not something you can learn in a classroom. It's something that you learn on the field by doing it ultimately. Now there's few things here and there that maybe a business school might help with, but you're probably better off just asking other entrepreneurs, and they will probably provide you with probably better insight. And so I was like, well, like there is really nothing here that I think is gonna be useful to me, to achieve these goals. I wanted to go into banking and consulting. My undergrad doesn't matter. I don't find it intellectually stimulating. The internships are dull and boring, and it doesn't even teach me how to be an entrepreneur. Um, and so the answer to this question is no. And at least don't do it as an undergrad. Go to business school as an MBA student. Go study something technical, something you cannot pivot back into if you were to, or would be very difficult to pivot back into if you were to actually go to business school as an undergrad. Go do that. Go do computer science. Go do biological sciences. Go do something like that that maybe you're interested in, and then go work in that field for a few years, see what you like and don't like, see what you learn, and then if by someday you're interested in doing something in the world of business, go into banking, go into consulting, work in the field of marketing, working in product management, then go to a business school, do an MBA. MBAs enjoy and like to have people from different backgrounds come in and study in there. They don't want to build a class just of 100% students that just studied undergraduate, um, went to an undergraduate business administration school. No, they want to have a class from different backgrounds. They want to have doctors, they want to have engineers, they want to have probably salespeople, they want to have scientists, historians. Like they like to build a class of a diverse backgrounds. And in 2 years, they will teach you, the important things you need to learn about finance and economics and statistics for the world of business and accounting and all of that, leadership and organizational behavior and all of those things. So I think that's the TLDR. If you want to study business, do it as an MBA student. For your undergrad, prioritize something a bit more technical. You will be thankful later on in your career if you decide to do that. See you in the next one.